So picture this. You are working on a mixed reality pool game set in Regency, England. The controllers, a Tilt 5 pool cue, and an extant Victorian etiquette book. The goal is to get players emotionally invested in pool balls as complex characters with their own emotional inner worlds and relationships. Easy, right? Billiards, but they're people. What's not to love? But giving the balls names and voices and faces isn't working. The connection between the strategy of pool and Regency social maneuvering sounds novel and fun, but it actually just feels like playing pool. So we have a physics puzzle game that wants to be a social simulation. And right now, your players care about neither. What can you do? Call up your narrative designer and say, design more lovable anthropomorphic balls? What if it's not actually a design problem? Do you even have time to be thinking about this? What you need is a practiced critical eye, and that eye is the eye of an editor to make the magic happen. But who am I to be standing up here telling you all of that? My name is Marissa Koors, and I've been a narrative editor for indie game studios for the past several years. Before that, I spent a decade as a book editor for Wiley and Hachette in the book publishing industry, which is an industry with a very established editorial culture. Since getting into game development, I've worked on games like Ape Law's Alice's Lullaby, Indiecade nominees like Puckish and Anti-Fun-Block's Zoran's Run, helping game developers wordsmith their game's text and grow cohesive and coherent forests from the storytelling of their trees. Today, I'm here to show you how an editor can help you cultivate a culture of concision across disciplines, introduce organization and structure to relieve pressure on game developers who are doing it all, and optimize limited resources through lightweight, flexible practices that keep teams nimble and make their games better. I've watched development teams do astonishing things with limited budgets, limited personnel, and limited time. And today, I want to share some concrete strategies for how an editor can help game developers maintain creative velocity while actually keeping the narrative flexible enough to respond to what the game actually needs, rather than what it was predicted to need 6 months ago. Editing can feel like a magic trick because most of the time, you don't even know that it's been done. If you've ever read a book, you've benefited from the craft of editing. And you're doing it without even realizing it. Sometimes this lives with leads, sometimes with writers, sometimes with QA and playtesters. But it happens every time that you tighten a line of dialogue, reroute a narrative branch, or cut a scene. And like any good magic trick, all traces of your work should disappear. The best magic goes unobserved. And every magic trick consists of 3 parts. You already know where I'm going with this because I've told you, with a cultural reference and a visual cue. Maybe not my subtlest work, nor my most legible if you haven't seen The Prestige, but it is concise. Economy matters, whether you have 15 minutes to speak or you're working evening hours, exhausted from a day job on a limited budget with a 30-day trial of Slack, Twine, Claude, and a team of 3 developers, each wearing 6 hats. But first, let's define some terms. Practically speaking, editors fix narrative and technical writing on multiple levels, track the organization, iteration, and publication of that content, and create a unified presentation of intellectual property for a game, a franchise, and a company. That's a lot to dig into, so let's go a little higher. What is game editing? Traditional editing has been around long enough to specialize. Books and newspapers have different kinds of editors with different responsibilities. Game editing is newer, not as established, but it uses the same principles, adjusted for the needs of an interactive medium. One of those is editing on multiple levels. An editor in video games can provide all-in-one service, from developmental editing to structure and style, down to copy editing and grammar and punctuation. But regardless of level, as Cameron Harris put it in her canonical 2014 GDC talk, "You Need an Editor," editing is the art of invisibly refining the author's intentions. So let's break that down, as she did. Art. Editing is not a science, or else we'd be having computer programs that could edit everything perfectly all by themselves. And in spite of the advent of AI, they haven't yet mastered exceptions to rules, especially with creative work. Sometimes you need to break them, and it's a person who's best suited to figure out when and how to do that without breaking anything else. Invisibly, you should never notice edits. The writing should sound as if it had always been that way, straight from the author's mind. Seamlessness is especially important when you have more than one author adding words to your game. multiple writers, narrative designers, so on. An editor can nudge those voices closer together, make the writing sound like it belongs to one product without losing the voice of the individual author. Refinement. Editors work with what's already there, shaping and preserving and standardizing. Editors are not writers. Think about it as making the writing what it always wanted to be, like the statue emerging from a block of marble. That sculpting can include rewrites, but usually not whole-scale changes without the author's input. Author. Editing is about the author, not the editor. We don't insert ourselves into the writing except in collaboration, and it isn't a competition between the author and editor. That's another reason why this is an art and not a science. Finally, intentions. Editors often work more from what an author is trying to say, deciphering subtext and digging out meaning that's hidden in the words because an author isn't entirely clear on it themselves. That's where the relationship becomes vital and can really pay off. The better we know an author, the better the results. Editors will also work on higher level intentions, what the game needs from the writing, not just what the author wants to do. For example, inserting reminders of essential information that the player picked up 2 levels ago, or streamlining text in one area to make up for overages somewhere else to remain in budget. Knowing those needs requires the editor to have a game-wide understanding, which the author may not have because they are focused on their own section or they were brought onto the project late. An example might be helpful, especially if you haven't yourself worked with an editor before. So let's try it out. This is the initial draft of Cameron's description of the art piece from her definition. Take a few minutes and the red pen that you have with you and see if you can't tighten it for yourself. This is warming the cockles of my once wanted to be a professor heart to watch everyone quietly editing. Me? Wanted to be a professor?
Will this be on the test?
Clearly we're about to grade your homework, so if you know me, you know live grading is one of my favorite things.
Yeah, I got it. Just like shook it.
Also, the red pens are yours to keep, because everyone should have a red pen.
I brought my own.
All right, everybody ready? Let's check our work. So right away, we can see there's some unnecessary repetition in the words. Human, their, art, work all show up twice. The repetition of the word rules sets up a juxtaposition that combines the two halves of the point into a whole. So originally, Cameron kept this, but the placement wasn't quite right, and she knew that too. However, in 2026, with AI now as a dominant force in a way that it wasn't then, the update actually gives us the opportunity to be more concise and cut one of them by adding an em dash. The initial tone was also off a little bit. A little bit more informality and humor will soften the start of an otherwise pretty wordy slide. Punch that up with an implied slam on computers and AI at the top. We've all been there and can smile at it. And we'll upgrade wants to needs to suggest the importance of craft without dragging out that for your art cliche. Go with person instead of the more clinical human, and end on another light note that nevertheless underscores the importance of editing, which ties right back into the talk's thesis as a supporting point should. And there's the version that I just read. It's shorter, smoother, tighter, and more effective. It's far from perfect, but after just 2 edit passes, Cameron's initial one 10 years ago and my own, it's definitely better. So editing improves writing. But how does that functionality express itself on a game development team? In AAA, editors function as second or backup brains for leads. But however, on several indie projects I worked on, I was the sole narrative resource apart from the creative director. This created a relationship more reminiscent of the author-editor relationship in book editing, where authorial vision is the work of one person, and an editor's job is to help the author refine that execution. So to edit for games effectively, you must stand in for the player while also grasping what the narrative team is trying to accomplish at high altitude. And to publish a game well, you must combine that understanding of narrative vision with your knowledge of the marketplace, of what players are looking for and how they find and experience it. The editor then is a connector, a conduit from narrative team to publisher to player, but also a translator who is helping improve communication from each to the other through the fluent expression across languages of what's most essential to a game's creative and commercial integrity. Many studios still see editing as a luxury, a final pass on dialogue, but that's an outdated assumption, which is becoming increasingly so as development budgets tighten and Gen AI encroaches. Editorial work isn't about making games more literary. It's about creating coherence and safeguarding player experience, especially when Gen AI output is contradictory, vague, or lifeless. Indie team structures in particular don't have to figure out where an editor belongs on the org chart or wait to have the headcount to bring one onto a project either. That means editors for indie studios especially are empowered to shape their role on the team to the specific needs of a game and to offer their domain expertise and capacity to meet them. On each game I've edited, I've played a different role. Puckish needed an editor to be a systems designer, finding the narrative in the physics instead of bolting the story on top. Alice's Lullaby needed an editor to be an archaeologist and a surgeon, cutting away the ghost of what the game used to be. And Zoran's Run needed an editor to be a strategist, protecting the game from scope creep and keeping the focus on the real political narrative outside of the game. But before I talk about more specific practices, I want to establish the principles driving them. How exactly do editors work with writers? Because if you hire an editor without understanding how they work or how to work with one, you'll end up with a process that feels more like a rabbit and a hat than a magic trick. We'll start with the pledge. The magician, here the author, the narrative lead, the creative director, establishes their creative vision and sets its parameters. Maybe this takes the form of a beat sheet, a sprawling design document brimming with lore, a story plan mapped into acts, or something that looks a little more like a Pepe Sylvia style corkboard. Sometimes it's a statement like, I want the player to feel a character's catharsis, a desire to break a world's rules, or the absence of a companion. Other times, it's what the creative director wants the game to do in the world, like bolster a political campaign or raise awareness about a social issue. In all these cases, editing begins and ends with authorial intent, and so a good edit lives and dies on how clearly an author can articulate their vision and how well an editor can read its subtext. The editor's role in this act is not to interfere or interject, but to react and to refine. As an editor, you're both the author's dialogue partner, performing the second half of the patter, and the audience member called up on stage to inspect the trick. Editors help the author establish their visions by asking the questions that clarify it. The clearer the vision from the outset, the stronger the prioritization and orientation around it across the team. But here's the more critical thing. Editors ultimately trust the game more than the documentation. Your actual game is our source of truth. Remember that Regency pool game, Puckish? The creative director's design target was to have the players spend 95% of their time thinking about their next shot, and only 5% of their time taking it. For him, players empathizing with the balls as characters was part of a pledge to bias players towards slower, more strategic play through immersion. Now for the turn. This is the bulk of a game's narrative engineering, executing the vision and intent that you've established, turning theory not just into practice, but playable experience that gets as close as possible to fulfilling the ultimate pledge. Here, the editor's role is actually more removed, as the turn is really the work of narrative design. You are not the magician's assistant. You are the magician's editor, and an editor isn't responsible for actually executing their own feedback. What an editor can do at this stage is help amplify and optimize what the narrative team produces in service of fulfilling the vision that they've already articulated. Take, for example, the need to minimize dependencies. Indie narrative can change on a dime, and an editor can track what parts of a game depend on one another and know what pieces are load-bearing so that the writers can structure choice in ways that don't cascade and destroy the whole narrative house from the inside out. We aren't making the engineering decisions, but we are providing the team with a blueprint to help them design a more stable narrative. Returning to Puckish, the turn is prioritizing physics, and so naturally the story feels more ancillary and bolted on. Everyone advanced through the same story regardless of how you played, and that's where the immersion was breaking. That's where I began my editorial intervention. Because as both Christophers, Nolan and Priest, tell us, executing a vision isn't enough. You have to make it mean something. You have to make it fun. The prestige in narrative magic is the hardest part because it actually happens in the mind of the player, the impact of the game. The bulk of the editor's work actually primarily involves the prestige because that's where the player's experience lives. I call this holistic or narrative QA, where editors validate the behaviors that govern player engagement, immersion, and interaction, and diagnose mismatches. That means both being an internal team member and an informed advocate for player enjoyment. If a beat isn't landing or thematically not responding right, someone has to come in and find out why. And it's you. Running an editorial diagnostic helps focus the creative team on the elements of a game's execution that will make the most difference in closing the gap between vision and overall impact. Books or games, editing always has a single guiding purpose: shape the big picture of a narrative experience through all of the details that actually make that experience have meaning. For Puckish, we asked, what if the physical interactions are the narrative? What if Regency social dynamics were expressed through collisions, proximity, and who ended up in what pocket? When balls collided in specific ways, it triggered social violations or social opportunities based on Regency social rules captured by the Victorian etiquette book, Alt Controller. Suddenly, there's narrative consequences. The solution here was the concept known as a gaffe, or a social gaffe. A gaffe normally feels like a sudden drop in the background volume at a party because something's gone wrong, a record scratch. This is mechanically almost identical to when the player's actions in billiards require a resetting of the ball, called a scratch or a foul. Suddenly we have a parallel, and the narrative path emerges, organically from how players are playing pool. That means story and mechanics are no longer in parallel, they're intersecting. So what else can an editorial prestige look like? Let's look at two more specific examples of indie game editing in action. When I first came into Alice's Lullaby, their game had been stuck in development hell. The first build I played was, being frank, a Frankenstein's monster, a hybrid cobbled together from levels that had since been scrapped due to an overambitious original vision that had caused years of delay and had already lost the sequel the substantial market momentum of its predecessor. Levels built for an open world structure had been bolted onto a now linear progression. A sprawling lore document referenced characters, locations, and plot points that no longer existed in the playable game. The development team was exhausted. They knew it was broken, but felt paralyzed. And every conversation about cuts spiraled into relitigating why the original vision had been abandoned. This is where that principle, the game is the source of truth, became critical. The design doc told me what the game used to be, but the game itself was telling me what it actually was. And those were two very different things in this case. So I conducted a build autopsy. I played through the entire build of the game, cataloging every narrative beat, character appearance, and lore reference. Then I created this kind of ghost content map where I tagged things like exists in build, or referenced but missing, or needs first game knowledge, or lore document only. Suddenly, the creative director could see the narrative structural problems of the game at the same time as his overall holistic bird's eye view of the story across multiple installments. This is one of editing's most powerful tools, making invisible narrative dependencies visible to discuss what is and what we can realistically ship. From the massive lore doc, we pulled 8 to 10 story beats that were absolutely essential to Alice's story, and then focused on tying those together with a single but meaningful player choice for her at the end. Everything else went into a deferred world-building document for the next game. At the same time, I built trust with the creative director by asking questions that distilled an achievable pledge from those beats, and fleshed out the story Bible so that future narrative priorities for the third installment were documented and established when the time came. The game that shipped was not the original vision, but it was coherent. The convoluted Franken lore actually created an opportunity. By converting a lot of the cut content into note pickups and environmental storytelling, the game world actually felt deeper than the playable space. Players picked up on this in Steam reviews, praised the world as built so carefully and lovingly that it eats you alive while you're there, and called out the ending in particular for selling them on the complex lore as what indie horror should be. Zoran's Run had a hard deadline. Launch before the 2025 New York City mayoral election, and also an unusual mandate. The game's purpose was to bolster a politician's campaign and create a fun, accessible experience that would get shared on social media. The actual game itself was pretty simple. It was a snake-style runner where Zoran Mamdani navigates through neighborhoods, collecting supporters and talking to NPC constituents. But the team wanted to keep building interior narrative, dialogue trees for Zoran, character arcs for recurring NPCs. They were designing a BioWare-esque ARPG. But the target player was someone who might not even call themselves a gamer. The real narrative, the one that mattered, was actually out in the world. The question that crystallized this for the development team was, when someone finishes playing this game, what do we actually want them to do? The answer wasn't feel invested in Zoran's backstory, although many of us are. It was feel like Zoran cares about their community, remember 2 to 3 things about his platform, have fun, and ideally share the game and vote for him. We determined that the game's fun, in this case, came from speed and gameplay, not story. So we implemented the 6-second rule. If a story moment took longer than 6 seconds to parse, we ruled it too complex for scope. It worked. In the finished game, Zoran functions as an entirely silent player protagonist, a stand-in more than a character. The script of the game was cut to a mere 16 pages, tight, economical, and focused on jokes and pop culture over narrative. The collectible artifacts that you found were the real storytelling, succinct in-world documents inspired by real-life events that tell the story of the 2025 New York City mayoral race. Zoran's Run launched 2 weeks before the election and still has 100% recommended reviews on Steam. Not one of them mentioned story. The takeaway? Sometimes an editorial prestige isn't actually about powerful storytelling at all. Impact is governed by how well the turn delivers on the pledge. So 3 principles I've learned across my career for a powerful prestige. The first is that editing is 75% relationships. You can't quantify it with a KPI, unfortunately, but creative trust between an author and an editor is the single most predictive factor of success in any editorial process. Because if an author doesn't trust that their editor can actually help them connect pledge to prestige, vision to impact, then an editor's work won't affect the turn, the game's actual execution. Trust between the creative director on Alice's Lullaby and I made hard cuts possible without destroying morale. Puckish transformed from an AR pool game with a Regency England narrative veneer to a social simulation that happens to use pool as its interface because trust made it safe to ask, what if the physics are the narrative, without that development team feeling criticized. The second is dialogues over directive. Effective editors aren't actually afraid to challenge or question, but equally, they know when to listen to writers about why they care about what they care about, why what's important to them is important to them. Get curious instead of being prescriptive, and be convincible where you can be, because bad feedback is what happens when you try to convince any writer that they're wrong. On Alice's Lullaby, instead of demanding cuts, I created that ghost content map and let the creative director see the problems, while advocating to preserve and focus resources on the story beats that he considered most essential. On Zoran's Run, the team accepted that their deep branching narrative wasn't the goal. Their competing vision was still valid, but it didn't align with their pledge. Finally, reduce the cognitive load. Writers love complexity, and editors do too, but sometimes narratives that only exist in lore bibles or an internal wiki can actually enhance game narrative without being on screen. Players are easily overwhelmed, and simplifying can actually activate their imagination while streamlining and deepening their overall engagement and fun. We stripped the dialogue trees from Zoran's Run. We moved Alice's Lullaby lore from the broader build into note pickups, environmental storytelling, or even the next game. Being concise doesn't just mean optimizing limited resources. It improves quality overall by insisting on more from less, while giving players less to process at the same time. When you have an editor who understands the three-act structure of narrative magic, the pledge, the turn, and the prestige, and you have someone who can then apply those lessons, you have someone who can help you connect vision to impact and structure the work of your team to serve that. That is what allows us to get fidelity to creative intent from the beginning of the process when the game is actually designed and scoped to the end of the process when the player plays it and connects with that initial intent in their brain when they're contributing to it through their own agency. And that's it.